Hi, I'm Brandy Neal, the writer and producer of the Radical Candor podcast. Today, to kick off 2023, we're going to hear some stories from our Radical Candor coaches and core team about times when they received radical candor or times when they behaved with obnoxious aggression or manipulative insincerity. If you can relate to any of these stories or you'd like to write in and tell us your radical candor story, you can do so by sending it to podcast@radicalcandor.com. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Amy Sandler, the lead coach and podcast host at Radical Candor, and I want to take you back in time about 15 years ago, long before Zoom and video calls. I'm working on this really big technology project, and my role, I'm responsible for content for the website as well as for user research. So questions like, what was it people wanted from the website? Why would they visit it? What kind of content, what kind of functionality would make it really engaging for people? I also was responsible for internal promotion, for getting the word out about this project. And it was really exciting. The project consumed most of my waking and non-waking hours. There was just one problem with this project. There were a lot of technical issues. And so every time there'd be this big deadline, we'd rush to meet the deadline, and it just wouldn't work. It was really frustrating for everyone. And by everyone, I mean me, because at that time in my career, it was all about me. Now, because there were so many technical issues, the project owner, who was several layers above me in what was at the time a very hierarchical organization, they didn't prioritize the work I was doing. So I'd produce research reports, reviews of functional requirements, creating content, editing content, and it just felt like all of this was going into a huge black hole. Getting more and more frustrated, it became clear there was just one thing for me to do. I wrote an email to the CEO, chairman of the board, outlining how this project owner was wasting millions and millions of dollars and tens of thousands of hours of people time. It was a great email. Clear, concise, compelling, also quite satisfying to write. It was, however, what we would call career limiting. But even more important, it just wasn't the right thing to do. I should have reached out to that person directly. Now, it was hard because we didn't have the tools at the time we have now. I was the only person on this project team who wasn't in the home office. But if I'm really honest with myself, I think what was going on for me also was this idea that somehow we think it's okay to kind of kick up, to act like a jerk above us because this person is higher than you in the organization. But they still deserved me doing this in a one-on-one fashion rather than doing it publicly. I think when we're exhausted, when we're stressed, we don't always think about the idea that the people we're working with are still people. And so I acted like a real jerk. That is my obnoxious aggression story. Now, often after we've acted like jerks, rather than moving up on care personally, we actually back off the challenge directly. We call this manipulative insincerity. This is backstabbing, gossip, political behavior. It's manifest in the sort of meeting after the meeting when we're talking about someone, not to them. And so years passed, I'm still in this organization, and the project that would not die continues to go on. I'm now in a different role, has nothing to do with the project, and there's a new project team and a new project owner comes on board and led a meeting updating a bunch of us on the project. Now, she had no idea that I'd worked on this project, and so she kicks off the meeting by saying, the reason why this project didn't work was because there was no research. Now, I'm sitting in this meeting. I'd spent years of my life doing the research, and then a few more years trying to tell people about the research. But at that point, I'm so burnt out, I'm so stressed and exhausted. I just nod and I smile along, say, that makes so much sense. And in my head, I'm thinking, good luck with that. Now, this is really hard for me to look at. I think these kinds of stories are hard for us to look at can be fun to tell stories when we've acted like jerks or when we are ruinously empathetic, when we care so much we just don't tell someone the thing they need to know. Manipulative insincerity, I think, is a little different. It's not the kind of behavior we want to admit to, but it happens all the time. And there were really two big things that came out of this for me. One is I realized that my actions were very out of alignment with my values. And so it was a really great way to hold a mirror for what was really going on for me and changes I need to make. The other thing that happened was soon after I ended up in a new role, in a new organization. I had some more kind of hierarchical power that I needed to lay down. And I realized the importance of laying that power down. I was in meetings getting to know new colleagues, and rather than going in, telling them exactly what they needed to do, instead, I asked questions, I got curious, and I listened. And that is the value of my manipulative insincerity story.
My name is Stephanie Ustry, Radical Candor Coach. I want to share a story with you about a time that I received radically candid feedback and the impact that had on me and my career. Something to know about me before I get into this story is that I've always had a day job working in tech companies and startups, as well as my side hustle, doing executive coaching and radical candor training. In my last job, I was head of people for this incredibly fast-growing startup. And I oversaw all sorts of programs, everything from culture and values and organizational development to benefits and payroll and HR operations. And while there are some parts of this job I really loved, there are some parts that I just didn't have as much patience for. And it turned out that those pieces that I wasn't as excited about, well, my team was making some errors. And I had received feedback about it in small bursts, but I didn't really change any of my behaviors. Now, one day, my boss, the CEO, and I sit down for a one-on-one. And she looks at me and she says, Steph, I'm amazed at the way that you've helped grow this business. We've 10x'd in a year, and that's largely thanks to you and how you've led your organization. But the thing is, Steph, I'm not sure if you really want this job. While you're really good at the culture and the leadership side, the mistakes your team is making when it comes to operations and things like payroll, they're getting more and more egregious. And frankly, the fact that the equity grants were wrong, that's a problem too big to overlook. And she said, I've thought about this and I wonder if you really want this job. Do you really want to be a head of people? Because if so, you've got to be good at everything. You can't just pick and choose. And look, Steph, if not, that's okay. I'm going to support you, but I need you to make that choice. You've either got to double down and make sure these errors don't happen, or we've got to talk about looking at a transition. When I heard this feedback, I was furious. I had been advocating to get more support for my team. I had told them when I was hired that those weren't my areas of expertise, and now they were holding it against me. And so I fought her, and she listened. And she said, I hear you, but I need you to decide. Do you want to be great at this, or is this the right thing for you to do? I went away from that meeting angry, disappointed, and let down. But she kept following up with me saying, hey, have you thought about our conversation? And I thought about it, and I reached out to mentors, and I talked to my friends, and I realized that maybe my dream to be an HR leader wasn't my dream after all. Maybe it was to go and focus on my business. And finally, I made the decision that she was right. We made a plan for my exit, and eventually I did transition to work for myself full-time. Now, if it wasn't for her being willing to give me that incredible direct challenge to make a choice to do better or to make a choice to get out, I don't know that I ever would have had the courage to leave and work for myself. And look, I see clients all the time who are confronted with this feedback and they choose to fight for that job. But it's without having received the feedback, we can't be in choice. And that's why radical candor, being willing to show people that you care, but also give them the direct challenge is so critical.
My name is Becca Barish, and I'm a candor coach who has training as a licensed clinical social worker and also as an improviser. And if my parents ask, I'm also definitely still considering law school. I used to work with somebody, we'll call him Eric for the purposes of this conversation. And something that I found about Eric was that when we were in collaborative, ideation-based conversations, he generally didn't listen very much to the people in the room that were not his friends. And so we had a session where he was like, let's all get together. Let's throw out as many ideas as we possibly can for a video that we were putting together. And in the room was him, his friend, 2 other people, and myself. And we're just throwing out as many ideas as we possibly can. I wrote down every idea, who said which idea. And at the end of coming up with probably about 10 or 11 ideas, he said, you know what, it looks like we haven't really come up with as many as we need today. So let's come back and have another meeting. And I was like, can you let me know what ideas you think that we've left with at the end of this meeting? And the ones that he reflected back to me were the 2 or 3 ideas that he and his friend had come up with. And so in that moment, I subtly pulled out my cell phone and started texting the other 2 people in the room to say, this is so typical him. I knew that this was going to happen. I made a list of who said what. I know that there's so many more ideas than this. That idea of not caring and not challenging, I wasn't caring. I wasn't having the honest conversation that I needed to have with him about how that experience felt. And I wasn't challenging. I was getting my frustrated energy out, but I wasn't putting it in any sort of a productive direction. And I was frustrated about the fact that he was creating this chasm of the people he was friends with and the people that he wasn't. But what I was doing was actually strengthening that and making it more intense by making more of this us versus them with this private chat that I was having with other people.
Hi, my name is Farah Mitra, and I want to tell you about some of the toughest feedback I've received in my career. So a few years ago, I moved from San Francisco, California to Houston, Texas to be near a very sick family member. And that meant leaving my in-person role as a VP of people at a tech company in San Francisco. And because I love both giving and getting feedback, I made sure to have these sessions with my teams before I left. And I think, most people might do a session to say, hey, what's something I could stop, start, or continue as I head on to my next job. And I had what I thought personally was a much harder, hairier question on my mind, which is, I wanted to know if I should even do the same role again. In full transparency and vulnerability, I really struggled with leadership, and so I wanted to ask that question. And I am not the type of person who gets nervous. I speak in front of hundreds of people all the time, and I was nervous. I felt like this was such a hard question to ask, and I felt pretty nervous about it. I've given Jill feedback, and now it's time for Jill to give me feedback. And so we walk into the room, and before we could even sit down to do the session, again, palms are pretty sweaty, but before we could even sit down to do the session and start, Jill did this thing that was both really amazing and really unexpected. She was wearing this white hooded sweater, and she reached into her pocket and she handed me this crumpled jewelry pouch. And inside it was a purple necklace. Now, I know you don't know me, but I do love the color purple. And it wasn't just that Jill had given me this token of appreciation. It was also what Jill said next. She said, Farah, I couldn't be where I am today without your leadership and mentorship, even though we've only worked together a short time. And for someone who was feeling really nervous, that really helped me to relax into the conversation. I was still scared, but I felt more relaxed. So we go to start the session, and I look Jill right in the eye, take a deep breath, and I say, Jill, should I do this role again? Should I be an executive as I move to Houston? And she looked at me for what felt like an absolute eternity, but it was a millisecond. And she said, of course you should, Farah. You're really good at this. And so my shoulders started to come down a little bit more. I have 2 compliments. And she says, and I really want to tell you something because I think it would be really helpful. It's really obvious how much you care for this team. You are always there for us when we need you. And it's really clear how much you withhold information. And it makes me feel incredibly unsafe. And my heart broke into a million pieces because here I want to empower people with my life, and I have broken baseline psychological safety for a group of people. And she says, and I want to tell you one other thing, and it is going to be really harsh. The other day I was walking down the hall and I ran into a colleague, and that colleague asked me a question. It was a hard question, and I did not want to answer the question. So I skirted it, I danced around it, and I avoided it. And the colleague looked right back and said, come on, don't pull a Farah. So now I've learned that when you don't give out information or you withhold information, you're pulling a Farah or being like Farah. And full vulnerability, I started to cry. I found it really hard to hear what Jill had to say and what she had shared. And Jill did this thing that was absolutely incredible, and I'm so thankful for it. All she did in that moment was she held a really quiet, safe space, and she said, Farah, I know this is hard for you. And I cannot tell you how helpful it was in that moment for her to hold that space, to have that acknowledgement and have that empathy. And that space, because I'm highly analytical and I like to think things through, gave me just enough processing power, and I was able to think about it. And I said, I think I know what it is. I really want people to be okay. And because I want people to be okay, I withhold information. And now I am realizing it is probably way scarier not to know the thing than to know the thing itself. And you can imagine how much of an impact that had on me for Jill to give me that feedback. And it was hard, and it was hard to hear, but I think there were two things that Jill did incredibly well that helped me so that I wasn't crying so much I couldn't think, that I got angry, that I got defensive, that the feedback went completely over my head. Jill did two things well. She cared for me personally. She told me how much my leadership and mentorship had meant to her. And she challenged me directly. She told me the hard thing that over 100 people knew about me. She was brave. She was just 2 years into her career, and she had the courage to tell me the thing that would help me to grow and develop. And that's what Radical Candor is. Radical Candor is at the heart of caring personally and challenging directly.
Hi, I'm Mike Pugh, a member of the Radical Candor Facilitator team. And here's my favorite Radical Candor story. It happened many years ago when I went out to deliver one of my first Radical Candor workshops. It was for a marketing technology company in San Francisco. They had just raised a major funding round and had wisely chosen to make an investment in the development of their corporate culture. And it was a perfect fit for me. I had been a marketer for decades, so I knew the problems they were trying to solve for their customers. I had worked with lots of startups, so I knew the organizational challenges they were facing. And I was a highly motivated Radical Candor workshop facilitator ready to swoop in and make things happen. It was a 3-hour workshop for the entire company with a quick lunch break in the middle. To be honest, I was a little nervous at the start, but the group was highly engaged and my nerves faded quickly as we dove into the material. When we got to the halfway point, I excused everyone for lunch and thought to myself, well done. While I was patting myself on the back for a good first half, my sponsor approached me, probably to give me a pat on the back as well, right? Well, kind of. Mike, that was really good, she said. The team was engaged, they responded to the exercises, they were really having fun, and I'm excited about where this is going. I smiled. But may I offer you some feedback, she continued? You used a lot of sports analogies. Now, we're smart folks, so we can figure out what you're trying to say, but that's not really the language we use here. If you can cut back on that a bit, I'm confident we can go from good to great in this workshop. So there I was, the Radical Candor coach, there to teach others how to become more effective with their feedback, and I was the one on the receiving end of the Radical Candor. And it was a good example, too. She cared personally, striving for a great workshop for her team, for herself, and for me. She challenged directly, giving me the feedback I needed in a timely, actionable manner. And she didn't worry that I was supposed to be the teacher. Radical Candor was what I needed, and Radical Candor is what I got. So I skipped lunch, did a quick self-awareness check on how and when and why I was using all these sports cliches, and got ready to do better in the second half of our session. And it worked. I was the biggest recipient of Radical Candor that day, and I am so thankful for it. Not only did I give the client a better workshop, I think every workshop I've done since then has been better as well. And that's what makes Radical Candor so powerful.
Hi, I'm Jason Rosoff. I'm CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor, the company. 2012, I was the head of product and design for an organization called Khan Academy, an online educational not-for-profit. And it was my job to help the organization come up with a new product strategy that would allow us to serve teachers as well as we had been serving students for the last 5 years. My team and I spent months together researching, iterating, designing, testing, all kinds of new features. And after about 3 months, we came up with a plan that we thought was really great. The only obstacle in our way to implementing it was pitching our board of directors on this new strategic plan. One problem with that. I was deathly afraid of speaking in public, like flop sweats afraid of speaking in public. And I remember preparing for this session. And finally, my colleague Dana, who'd been working with me on the project, turned to me and she said, I give presentations like this all the time. Let me take the lead on it. And with immense relief, I turned over the responsibility of leading that presentation to Dana. Even though I wasn't presenting anymore, I was still nervous going into the session. And I remember walking into the room unsure about what the result would look like. But over the course of the next 2 hours, Dana did such an amazing job presenting our work that I was 99% sure that the board was going to give us the green light for the work that we had planned. And I walked out of that room sort of on cloud 9. And I remember Dana tapping me on the shoulder and asking me if I had a second. We stepped into an office and she said, "Hey, Jason, I'm really curious to know how you think that meeting went." And I offered her superlatives. I was like, "You were amazing. I'm so excited." And as I'm saying this, I notice that she's relaxing, which sort of catches me off guard. But then she says something that helps it make sense. She said, "I'm really glad to hear you say that because I looked over at you a bunch of times during the talk and you look pissed off. Honestly, I thought I was really screwing it up and you were mad at me." And as that was settling in, she said, "And I noticed other people noticing you look pissed off, and I'm worried it might have affected the support you were trying to show me during that conversation and show the work that we had done." And she wasn't done. She said, "And I'm sure that wasn't your intention. And that's exactly why I'm having this conversation with you, because maybe it's just me, but maybe it's not." And I knew exactly what I needed to do. I walked back to my team, and I met later with my boss, Sal, and I asked them, "Have you all ever noticed that sometimes my face and my words don't say the same thing?" And they said, "Oh, of course we have. We call that your thinking face." So I was like, great, not only has this happened before, but it's happened enough times that my team has given it a name. And I was really frustrated in that moment. So what I did was the thing we all do when we get feedback we don't love, is I went home and I complained about it to my partner, Jillian. And as I'm recounting the story to her, she starts to chuckle and she says, "Jason, of course this is a problem. For as long as I've known you, when you're doing something that requires your full concentration, it looks like you're in physical pain." It was in that moment, after 15 people on the same day had given me the same feedback, that I realized just how valuable and how kind the feedback that Dana had given me actually was. Not only did she show that she cared about me personally, by coming to me, speaking to me directly about it, and offering me the out of this not being my intention, but also she was clear enough with me that I could actually follow up on that feedback and learn something from it. And I'm still applying the learning from that feedback to this day. I'm a better leader and a better communicator because of it.
I'm Aaron Dimick, a Radical Candor coach. I've had the remarkable fortune of being a member of several high-performing teams, both in the military and since having retired from the military several years ago. I've also been a member of a handful of less than stellar teams, one of which had a team member whose behaviors were far from the values espoused for the team. In fact, this was a team member that was more the do as I say, not as I do kind of team member. And I had a lot of difficulty with this team member and interacting with them because of that gap between values espoused and behaviors demonstrated on a regular basis. The one thing I did incredibly poorly was I was manipulatively insincere with this team member. I was happy to hop into conversations that were more backstabbing and politicking against this individual and not give them the radical candor that they really did deserve, but I was never willing to have that conversation. I didn't challenge them directly. I never really cared for them personally, publicly. I was even the initiator of some of the conversations behind this person's back because I wanted them to look worse and perhaps at times me better. So I knew that that was me fitting squarely in the manipulative insincerity quadrant, and I felt horrible because of it, and ultimately left that team because of it. There are some team members that we just act and behave in those types of ways. And it was on me that I never followed up with that individual to give them the radical candor they deserved, because I just continued to be in the space of manipulative insincerity.
I'm Kim Scott. I was living in Manhattan at the time, and I had this wonderful dog named Belvedere, golden retriever puppy. And I loved that dog. And in fact, I loved her so much, I couldn't bear to say a cross word to her. And as a result, she was completely out of control. So one night I'm walking her, and she keeps tugging into the street. I keep pulling her back, and a rushing cab comes by and almost hits her. I pulled her out of the way just in time. And I'm standing there with my heart in my throat, and this man standing next to me at the red light says, "I can see you really love that dog." That was all he had to do to move up on the care personally axis. Just a few words. I looked at him and nodded, and he said, "But you're going to kill that dog if you don't teach it to sit." Now he had my full attention. And then he just points at the sidewalk in this sort of harsh gesture, and he says, "Sit." Belvedere sat. I didn't even know she knew how to do that. I sort of looked at the man in amazement, and he says, "It's not mean, it's clear." The light changed. He walked off, leaving me with words to live by.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter at Candor, and find us online at radicalcandor.com.